Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for showing up this morning. Real excited to kick off this webinar as we kick off Oregon and National Invasive Species Awareness Weeks. This webinar, entitled Threats and Opportunities Invasive Species in Oregon, is an opportunity for us to introduce you all to a policymakers primer that the Oregon Invasive Species Council has recently released, and tell you some stories that follow along with those themes. My name is Troy Abercrombie, and I am the 2021 Vice Chair of the Oregon Invasive Species Council, and also the coordinator for the Western Invasives Network. I'd like to introduce the other panelists here today. Dr. Teresa Thome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Sarah Navarro, U.S. Forest Service, Sam Chan, Oregon Sea Grant, Wyatt Williams, Oregon Department of Forestry, Rick Boatner, our 2021 Chair of the Council from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, also Representative David Brock Smith, and our Council Coordinator, Jillian Littlejohn. And just a quick little bit of housekeeping, the agenda. Well, my mouse isn't working. Next slide. So I'll give a short introduction, pass it over to Representative Smith, and then we will go into our main presentations. We're going to have a co-presented feature on zebra mussels and mossballs. We will then have an overview from Wyatt Williams on Oregon's collaborative approach to invasive species management and prevention. And then we will hear a case study from Sarah Navarro that talks about sudden oak death and the Sudden Oak Death Task Force. Next slide. And we will also announce a new award that the council would like to give out after a moderated question and answer session with the speaker panelists. Next slide. And so with that, I want to pass it over to Representative David Brock Smith. He is our House liaison for the Oregon House of Representatives, and real happy that you could be here today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Troy, and appreciate the welcome, and it's an honor to be with you all. In my screen, I see Teresa, Sarah, Sam, of course, and then of course you, Troy, Wyatt. But I see Teresa, as we recently worked on those zebra mussels in the aquariums, right? And how critically important your and your colleagues' work were in aggressively addressing that right away. I can't thank you enough. Everyone, I'm, as Troy mentioned, State Representative David Brock Smith. It's a privilege to be here with the Oregon Invasive Species Council. I can't thank you enough for all of your work in addressing the invasive species in Oregon. Just a little history. I was a former Curry County Commissioner. Of course, sudden oak death was founded on the landscape in Curry County in 2001. As I was leaving my role as a county commissioner and coming to the House of Representatives for Oregon, I was able to form a sudden oak death task force, and with my friend and colleague and just an amazing contributor, Senator Jeff Merkley, and his knowledge of the pathogen and has been just instrumental in the work of the task force and addressing resources to help fight this invasive species. We finished our work thanks to, of course, Sarah and Ellen and others on the task force strategic plan in May, well, early June of 2017, so just in a few short months. Later, we worked with Highland Economics and Mason, Bruce, and Gerard and the Oregon Department of Forestry, and of course Sarah was instrumental in all of this as well, in the economic impact assessment of sudden oak death, which is bleak, to say the least, with this disease. Recently, and Sarah will get into more detail with her presentation, we have a EU1 infected, of course, there's, for those that don't know, you have an NA1 strain and the EU1 strain. The EU1 strain is much more aggressive, twice the sporulation counts and so forth. And we have identified, or Sarah and her team have identified, a infestation outside of the partial quarantine area within Curry County. Even more recently, and she aggressively, and her team aggressively treated that area. Even more recently, however, we have identified, and by luck and expertise of an OSU researcher that was down doing baiting for sod, noticed a tan oak that was in distress along Highway 101 north of Port Orford, and took samples, and preliminary samples show that it is infected with sod. So we're in the process of contacting private landowners around that area. And Sarah, you'll be happy to know that I was able to get at least half the phone numbers on that list that I received yesterday, and you should have a more extensive list by the end of day today of those contacts. Sudden oak death is just, it's a very dangerous disease, especially the EU1 strain in the region, the economic impacts that it could have on not just Southwest Oregon, but Oregon in general, and all of the investments that we've put into and continue to do so for the Port of Coos Bay and import exports. I can't thank the team enough for all of their work in addressing this horrible disease, and AOC and County Solutions for their partnership with the state. Of course, Sarah's in fantastic work as with ODF and now with USFS in leading the operation, and all of her colleagues. And of course, all of you and the Oregon Invasive Species Council and your support in addressing this and many other invasive species that are impacting our natural resource industries in the state. And so with that, I will just thank you for all of your good work again. And if there's any quick questions, Troy, I don't know if you want to have a little time for that before I sign off, but I'm happy to try to address anything that anyone might have.
Yeah, I know you're on a tight schedule today, Representative. What we're going to do is we're just going to collect questions throughout the webinar. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and drop them in the question box, and we can go ahead and forward those on to you if you don't mind, and you know, have you respond, and we can distribute those for you. Give you some time to think about it, and we'll pass on any questions that we might have. So again, I really appreciate you being here. Appreciate your support, and I've seen in a lot of invasive species meetings lately. So just really appreciate you being there and bringing a voice from the House of Representatives to these issues.
Well, thank you, Troy, and thank you all again. Thanks you for all your work.
All right, next slide. I'm going to give you all just a few broad talking points to kind of set the stage for the great presentations that we have in store for you. And one of the first things, I see a lot of invasive species professionals in the crowd, but some other names I don't recognize, and folks who may not be quite as in tune with some of this. And so one of the questions you'll get sometimes is, why should we care? And one of the questions I ask myself sometimes is, why do I care? And the simplest answer is that invasive species are just simply a shared burden that affect us all. The threats are numerous, and they put our shared values at risk. On the monetary side, they cost us millions of dollars statewide via impacts to economical, environmental, social, and cultural resources. And when we're talking about those social and cultural resources, we're talking about a cost that is more than just dollars. And I think that's really important. Next slide. And so we have statewide impacts and regionally specific threats. And part of what makes Oregon so great is also what makes being in this discipline more challenging. We have a ton of unique ecosystems in this state. We have unique cultural and economic components in each one of those regions. And with that, variable resources and infrastructure available for those local partners to address these challenges. And then specific to the actual species itself, where that species is on the invasion curve really can change the game on the approach that we have, the amount of options that we have or not. And so all those things put together, what you start to realize is that prevention, next slide, is the way to go here. And so it's the best way to never let them get established in the first place. And in this graphic, while the cost is reflected in dollars again, there are other costs, and it's important to remember that. And as an infestation or infestations move along that invasion curve, those costs rise with it across the spectrum, whether they're monetary or otherwise. And so in order to achieve that prevention, next slide, requires a large multi-layered network of engaged partners and stakeholders. And some of those partners may not even realize that they're a critical link within that network. Next slide. And so it requires communication across, within, and throughout that network to build the connections and relationships that we need to facilitate truly coordinated responses to these threats. Next slide. A big part of that is our state and federal agencies, and there are many. And there are many more folks who are part of this network who are not reflected here. These are just some of the partners and just at a particular scale. And I think that's a word you'll hear a lot today. The nuances of scale with invasive species are important. And so there are many, many more local, county, NGO, and volunteer partners at various scales and with their own various focus. And it's at those scales where a great deal of the on-the-ground work actually takes place. And so in some ways, these logos don't just represent the agency partners themselves, but by the nature of the resources that these agencies manage, these logos represent pathways. And when the focus is invention or is prevention, these pathways are the first line in the sand. Next slide. And so you'll see numerous examples today of different pathways and how an undetected invasion through one pathway can facilitate further spread through others. The graphic you see here, you'll hear a lot about, you'll hear these terms quite a bit as we get into the zebra mussel and mossball presentation. From aquaculture to watercraft to firewood. Next slide. And contaminated nursery stock. The pathways into Oregon are as diverse as the species that travel them. And for a full list of all the different pathways that the council and all of our partner agencies and network partners focus on, you can check out the legislative and policymaker primer on the website. Next slide. And so for every species, there is a pathway, and for every pathway, there is a resource at risk all across the state. And so cutting off invasives at the pathway is so important because prevention is something that facilitates conservation and preservation and then promotes resiliency. Whereas invasive species establishment in the absence of prevention is something that will then require management, maybe restoration and enhancement. And so the more pathways and the more resources connected to those pathways, the more threats that we face. Next slide. On the coast, we've got things like European green crab, where populations are increasing due to warming estuaries. We have dirty gorse down on the south coast. That's been a long-standing problem and threat to beach and dune habitat, to public safety. And then across the state, we faced other threats like zebra and quagga mussels, annual grasses like ventonata, and then even in our most remote and culturally significant landscapes, still more threats like the newly discovered Turkish thistle, which you see down there near the Owyhee Canyon in this graphic. It was actually found up at the top of the state in Hell's Canyon, but some of these same areas are suitable, so it's just as well placed down there, I suppose. And so with all these diverse resources, with all these diverse stakeholders, all these threats and challenges, it's easy to see, next slide, that the impacts to the region are shared, and that our investments in prevention and management are investments that are well spent. You can see there multiple different returns on our investment. Some of those are specific to a given species, but in general, you see these kind of returns for these type of management activities. And many of the savings that you see there are actually real dollars that are going into the pockets of Oregonians in the form of wages. Next slide. Super challenging, super complex, yet in Oregon we've done some really good work to date. A lot of great work. On the noxious weed side, we see over $15 million benefit from our biocontrol program alone. Programs like the Weed-Free Forage and Weed-Free Gravel program help strengthen local economies and provides access to new emerging markets that weren't available before. Inspection stations that help prevent introduction of aquatic invasive species, help prevent and protect infestation in different infrastructure, hydropower, recreation, irrigation, the whole bit. And then on the forest side, as Brock Smith, Representative Brock Smith mentioned, we're protecting hugely important domestic and international markets through these quarantines and through these prevention programs. If you have taken a look at the price of lumber lately, then you know how quickly those markets respond to outside pressure. And things like sudden oak death are certainly one of those things. Next slide. And so as good of a job as we've done, there's a lot more work that lies ahead. And that work's going to require the continued support of our current programs and resources at all scales, as well as enhancement and creation of new resources and tools. One of the things, not just specific to noxious weed control, but across the invasive species spectrum, is the need to diversify the funding streams that help support prevention and management efforts. Building up reserves, like our weed-free hay and straw. When we saw fire events like what happened last year, we weren't ready in that sense, and we ran out real quick. Supporting things like ODA's National Insect Identification Center and preventing additional pests from entering Oregon with increased support for border inspections. And so you're going to see a lot of examples today of the places where we've done a good job, as well as where we can concentrate our efforts going forward as you listen to these presentations. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first group of presenters. And I'd like to please welcome Dr. Teresa Thome, Regional Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Rick Boatner, Invasive Species Wildlife Integrity Coordinator at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the 2021 OISC Chair, and Sam Chan, Sea Grant Extension Statewide AIS Specialist and Associate Professor, Oregon Sea Grant. Thank you all. Looking forward to your talk.
All right. So hopefully you can hear me okay. And so just in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to have a team presentation here. My teammates, Rick Boatner and Sam Chan, and myself are going to highlight an interesting incident that has recently occurred in Oregon, in our region, and actually at an international level, tied to mothballs. See if we can. There we go. So Marimo, the mothballs, they're actually a filamentous algae, and they're widely sold for aquarium gardens, aquariums, water gardens. They're actually rather charismatic, kind of a neat plant to have. And what happened though in March, see if I can get this going. Yep, in March, we found contaminated mothballs with invasive mussels. And so it's not that the mothballs were invasive or a problem, but it was what was stuck onto them, which were dracaenid mussels, invasive mussels. You may have heard in the news about zebra and quagga mussels, and they really have been a tough invasive aquatic species introduced into the Great Lakes in the Midwest region in the early 1980s. And as we have enhanced our ability to identify these species with genetic analysis, it was discovered that there's actually 2 separate species, and they're primarily brought to North America through ballast water. That's the pathway of introduction from large cargo ships brought into the Great Lakes. And these 2 species of dracinid mussels, they have a variable lifespan between 3 and 9 years. They have both separate male and female individuals and have external fertilization. So they broadcast spawn, the eggs and sperm in the water that produce viable offspring, which is different from our native mussels. Our native unionid mussels actually use a fish host to complete their life cycle. So a little different of these invasive mussels, and it's a numbers game. One female mussel can release more than 40,000 eggs per cycle and have multiple spawning cycles throughout the year. And so quickly these invasive mussels can overpopulate and just dominate an ecosystem. And they are very adaptable into the habitats that they invade. They're filter feeders. And so just here's a little visual. One individual mussel can filter about 1 liter of water a day. So when you have millions of mussels, they're incredible at filter feeding. But you may think, well, that's maybe not such a bad thing to filter the water, but they're so good at filter feeding. They remove all the zooplankton and phytoplankton out of the water, all the tasty food particles, and then other animals, other fish, all the other things that live in the water that also utilize that kind of food, the phytoplankton and zooplankton, there's nothing left for them. So the zebra mussels and quagga mussels they're very good and proficient filter feeders, and they take away the food from other things. They also produce fecal pellets and pseudofeces that can be very high in contaminants. They also bioaccumulate contaminants. So they really do change the ecosystem dynamics, and also have extensive biofouling, which means they can basically get into tubes and filters and clog up all kinds of things, cover boats and docks and pipes, anything that could possibly be in the water, they attach to it and really cause a lot of damage, both economic and ecosystem damage. So it's trying to set the stage of why we care about zebra and quagga mussels and why they are such an invasive species in our aquatic habitat. And just a graphic to show that they've been pretty efficient at transporting across the United States since the introduction in the 1980s. And a lot of this is unintentional spread being attached to things that we like to move around, like boats or other equipment, docks, really anything that, barges, all kinds of equipment, gear that might be in the water for a little while that can easily be moved around. Also just downstream movement. So zebra and quagga mussels have moved around into the United States. So I do want to point out that there are some areas that have not, zebra mussels and quagga mussels have not impacted yet. And a big area is our Pacific Northwest habitat. And so that's why we have been so focused and laser focused on preventing zebra and quagga mussels from coming to the Pacific Northwest. And we practice as a team, not just the federal government, but our state partners, our outreach teams, all of us, multi-agency, we work every year, especially focused in the Columbia River Basin, to protect the basin from invasive mussels. And we practice what it would look like to respond to an invasion. And that's what happened in March. We received notification from the USGS that zebra mussels had been found in Seattle, Washington, associated with these mothballs. And so right away, from the work that we've done in practicing as a team with our network and communication and connections and coordination, we went right to work. It was an immediate response. at the local level, as well as at the federal level, as our state partners were responding to the incident in Washington. We were quickly realizing that this was not just a local one store, one product that was contaminated. When you think about the international scope of distribution of this plant, it quickly became obvious to us that this was not just in Washington. This was not just an issue for the Columbia River Basin. This was an international issue, and we had to address it. And so again, this contaminated plant, this algae, it's not necessarily that it is a problem of the plant. It was the zebra mussels that were hitchhiking that are actually injurious wildlife. Because they are so detrimental where they become established, they are listed on the Lacey Act and prevented from being introduced into the United States. The federal response, not just the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS, but Customs and Border Protection, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, worked very closely together, as well as working with our state and federal law enforcement at a very complicated and complex enforcement investigation. And then with across the nation and actually into Canada, looking at how widely dispersed these contaminated mothballs were. And not just through brick and mortar stores, but also through e-commerce and online. And so that's why we are considering this a very atypical aquatic invasive species challenge, because it quickly escalated from a local incident to an international one. And so we had two primary objectives, which is to stop any new importation of contaminated mothball products that had zebra mussels associated with them. And so that's where we had to work very closely with Customs and Border Patrol, as well as USDA and our Fish and Wildlife Service inspectors. And then sharing that information with the USGS to help share to our state partners, as well as through our Columbia River Basin team that we've worked very hard with. And then also then to address the contaminated products that were already in the United States in the supply chain, how to decontaminate aquarium, how to make sure that the contaminated mothballs, the zebra mussels, didn't become introduced into the environment. And again, it's a coordinated, immediate, multi-agency, multi-scale response. And it was rapidly changing. It was, and I'd like to try to talk about, it was extreme communication. And so how we were trying to communicate within our agencies and across agencies and sharing consistent, accurate information very quickly. Again, just some of the examples of the federal response. We're going to hear in a little bit from Rick Boatner at more of the state response. But again, this was happening pretty much all at the same time, trying to coordinate internationally across states and through our federal industry, as well as our industry partners. The work very closely with the industry right away on trying to make recommendations for distribution and cleaning and preventing any further introduction of contaminated product. Providing information to the public on what to do, as well as working with our ports of entry, and again, communication and talking and sharing information and trying to coordinate our actions on the ground. Going forward, this has really been an opportunity and of coordinating not just with our federal and agency partners, but also with the industry. Following this incident, they're very much wanting to help address this pathway and help reduce the impact as a part of providing customers with, again, continued federal coordination, and then working as well with e-commerce. That's kind of a new part of distribution. And then we hope to really take, this still is an emerging incident, but being able to assess how we've done and to improve in the future. And I just have a couple examples here. We do have our Columbia River Basin interagency team where we have a rapid response for zebra and quagga mussels. We practice this annually, and we work on our communication and how we would handle a situation like this. And that's that work, that ongoing work, has really served us well. And again, there's a huge amount of dedication and willingness to work together to keep our habitats, aquatic habitats, safe. I'm going to pass this on now to Rick.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Okay, I'm going to be talking more about what we did as in Oregon as to respond to this issue. To give you a little background, I'm just going to move to my slide next. Come on. There we go. In 2009, the legislator created the Watercraft Inspection Program for Oregon in regards to protecting Oregon from zebra and quagga mussels, because the likely pathway we thought would be on trailered watercraft coming into Oregon. In 2012, it was mandatory, and so we moved stations to the east and south and one on the north to intercept boats coming into the state. And this has been successful. We've stopped 150 plus boats with zebra and quagga mussels on them and inspected several thousand to close to 200,000 boats now. But this was the kind of the expected pathway we thought quagga and zebra mussels would arrive in Oregon or the Pacific Northwest. But we got a little surprise in March. And ODFW does have authority to look at pet stores, but we're looking in wildlife and animals. We weren't thinking about plants. We don't look at, we have no authority there. And in the pet store trade in Seattle, as Teresa mentioned, an employee found zebra mussels in these small bowls or a disc of Myanmar balls or moss balls. So that was quite a shock. And then others looked around, and anything that had these mirror balls in it had zebra mussels in them, or quite a few of them. And these all came from the Ukraine area through just a few distributors in Oregon, or not in Oregon, but in the US. So we're seeing them in these containers, we're seeing them in these packages. And as you can see from the pictures, we're talking about very small ones. These are, if you will, settler stage. They're not the size of a rice grain, so they weren't very big. But that started an interesting process. Just to share some of the timeline, and when things like these happen, as Teresa mentioned, we work with the Columbia River Basin, we practice these exercises, but this was one that it's here, will it work? So this was kind of the timeline. USGS received a report of zebra mussels from a pet store in Seattle in February of 21. They verified it and reported to Washington Fish and Game early March. We received notice on March 3rd from an email from a constituent back east that, and it was like, have you heard about this? This is what you got in your stores. And the answer was no at that time. Got the email, looked at the store, went out to a couple of our Petco and PetSmarts in the Salem area, because these were the same stores that they were found up in Seattle. And sure enough, we found zebra mussels in these products. We did bring in our expert to confirm the ID. And by 1 o'clock that same day, we already called the Columbia Basin meeting together, which Teresa talked about it, which is a multi-state province group that we talk about these things, we practice these things. We're trying to get ready for when they arrive. So we started an incident command structure set up to deal with these. But again, we deal on the regional basin way with the Columbia Basin, but the state also has to respond on its own based on its own authority. So that evening or late that afternoon, ODFW issued a news release letting the world know that we have these things in this product. And what was interesting about that news release went nationwide. And that very next day, we were getting phone calls from New York and other places saying, hey, I bought this product and it has zebra mussels in it. Also that evening, an alert went out from the Oregon Invasive Species Council, notifying people to be on the alert and keep eye on this one. We also at that time had staff from our agency start scouring the state with all the various pet stores and stuff. And we inspected over 126 stores, and all the stores were very, very cooperative. Once we explained what was going on, all of them on their own would remove the mothballs and remove them from the shelf until we could figure out what to do with these. In March 8th, we did post an aquarium video, how to disinfect your aquarium if you had that. To back up a little bit, when we first found these in the news release, we kind of did a knee-jerk reaction and went like everything in, as much killing stuff as you can to wipe these things out. And that was a little strong. In the video, we back off and make it more realistic, more real, that asking people that if you have a small tank, clean everything, disinfect it. If you got a larger tank that you just can't change real easy, just at least change your exchange water before you dump it. And as I said earlier, ODFW has authority over wildlife, but Oregon Department of Ag has authority over plants. So we approached Oregon Department of Ag, and they issued a temporary administrative rule that banned these products. So that made it complete. We had the authority on the animal side, also on the plant side to deal with these things. And relationships with other agencies is really important when you're fighting invasive species, to help each other, because again, each individually you have authority over something, but not combined, and this gives you a lot more strength. A news release to go out in Medford, and also in the Medford Tribune, and also ODA and ODFW released a joint news release talking about this quarantine coming up, or not coming up, in place, and it's in place for 160 days, and that also helps us to get a better grasp on this and kind of slow things down so we can deal with it much better. But as you can see, you know, when something hits, things move fast and furious really quick to try to deal with it if we can. So our next step is we got to find out if they got out into the environment. I mean, right now we're in a container, so they're contained, they're not loose in the environment, but we have to find out if they made it into the environment. And with that, we talked to the various fish district biologists around the state and try to identify what they would describe as aquarium dump sites. These were sites where they might have seen various aquatic plants that aren't native to the area. They may have found goldfish or other fish species. So we try to identify those dump sites, and we're going to prioritize them based on calcium and pH levels. So we can go back and do eDNA sampling this summer. And then if we do get any positive hits on environmental DNA, then we can do more in-depth sampling and find out what we're dealing with. You know, we're continuing communicating with all our partners, the other regions, other states, other provinces, the federal government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, APHIS, and all the other agencies that do have jurisdiction all together as a group on these things. And we're going to continue to do spot checks in stores just to make sure these aren't back on the shelf. And if they are on the shelf, they have been inspected and they've been found to be zebra or quagga mussel free. And as you can see, these things are very small, you know, like the size of a rice grain. So very difficult to see if you didn't know what you were looking at. Once you saw one, you could pick them up really easy, but it's not something you normally see on a little plant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you so much. And I want to, let's see. I might need to just use next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Toms and Rick Boatner, for sharing about their response, because it was so critical that many state agencies and federal agencies actually got together to really begin to understand, how these mussels and mossballs were coming into Oregon, where they were going. And without that, we probably likely would have had a possible infestation by now. Of course, right now we still have to be very vigilant in monitoring to make sure that this mussel did not come in alive, and that they did establish in our waters here in the Northwest, especially here in Oregon. So, if they had become established in Oregon, what would be the consequences? You heard earlier the large macro consequences from irrigations and dams and pipes, but I want to show you something very up close. So this is actually a size 3 child's running shoe that was actually immersed in a lake that actually had been infested with these mussels. Not here in Oregon, okay? This is actually this came from Lake Mead. And if you would venture to guess how long the shoe had been in the water, when I first, because I actually had this shoe put into the water, I knew how long it was in the water, but this was actually in the water for less than 3 months, actually a little over 10 weeks. And this is the growth on a shoe of what the mussels could do. I'll give you a close-up of it. There's a shoe. It even grows on the soft surfaces like the shoelaces, which this is a unique mussels because of its byssal threads, the way that it can attach to hard and soft surfaces. So quite destructive in terms of what it can do. And earlier, Teresa mentioned that each one of these could actually filter feed. How much was it? How much water? About a quart, I guess, right? In that range?
Liter. Yep, a liter.
Yeah,
a liter of water.
Yeah, about a liter. So I want to show you actually what a real moss ball looks like. So this is one right here. It's about a 3-inch moss ball. This one here. This thing apparently takes about well over 10 years to reach this size. And here's a smaller one. This one is a couple of years old. So they come in a range of sizes, and so because they are next slide, please. Because they're such a popular items, having these come in and then having them come in imported from, I believe it was the Ukraine, with remnants or sample with a possibility of the zebra mussels attached to them in different sizes and even in its microscopic plankton stage, really got many of us concerned, as you heard earlier. But what really got me from the university's perspective and OSU Extension's perspective very concerned is because these are very popular in the house decor and house plant trade. It's not just in the aquarium trade. So on one hand, you have hobbyists and pet owners, aquarium pet owners. On the other hand, now you also have people who are in the home decor, in the horticulture and plants and gardening, who are also part of this group. And so, so this broadens how these organisms can spread through these moss balls. And so when we learn about it, Rick's group at ODF and W were very keen and savvy in using social media. So within hours, the news of these of the mussels possibly spreading in moss balls had actually gone through social media, Facebook, and then Reddit and other social media, which was very important because it got people talking and thinking. Most people didn't know that this possibility existed, but many people started to realize that they knew that zebra mussels were not good. They did not know that these moss balls could be carrying them. So the moss balls are not the culprit. They just ended up coming from a source or waters that are infested. Because meanwhile, these are very popular as moss balls, as Teresa said, that they're kind of iconic. People enjoy them. People even have them as pets. And so how do you actually transform that interest in an item like the moss balls and also concerns about invasive species into something that from a problem into an education opportunity? So that's one of the roles of Oregon Sea Grant and Sea Grant Extension. Next slide, please. So on the same, virtually the next day after these moss balls were were discovered in the Seattle area, and after ODF&W and Rick's team and U.S. Fish and Wildlife started sharing social media, we decided to work with the Master Gardener Network, the OSU Master Gardener Network, because of the horticulture and houseplant pathway with it. And so the next day, we developed a social media post for about 4,200 active master gardeners who use social media. And then this was actually quickly disseminated to the national master gardener network across the country. So that's just one of the powers of social media these days. So master gardeners was contacted. Next, please. And also the OSU, the extension network across the country was also alerted to this problem. So with the federal response, the state response, and now the extension university response, all of these efforts, plus all the resend and resharing in social media, was able to really raise the awareness of this, as well as in the media world. So that's really important. The other aspect to this is that being that these mothballs, they're not the culprit. These mothballs are not the culprit. What is the problem is that they came in from a source water where these mussels are native, the zebra mussels. And so right now, with the quarantine that's been imposed by Oregon and several other states, which is that you want the situation to be certified free, how do you actually go about determining that or items are free from these organisms? Because we can't stop every single item in the trade. And so what's going to be happen is a way that we can learn that no matter what pathway they come in, when these do come in, next slide, that we actually have a way to screen and exclude, and even down to the Aquarius level, in that if you're exchanging water, always treat it with some of those decontaminants, like a small amount of bleach before you actually dispose of that water. So it's very important that we all practice biosecurity, and that's one of the roles that we can all practice, in that it's education about biosecurity. Whatever we do, inspect your items, inspect your plant. You see something that's odd, contact the Oregon Invader Hotline or the 1-866 Invader number and report that. Next, finally, next slide. And so the key aspect here is to think about biosecurity, inspect your items, look carefully, and then act biosecurely. And I think that will actually minimize a lot of problems in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, Teresa, and Rick. Really appreciate that. We're gonna go to Wyatt Williams here. I just wanted to say, though, again, thank you for everybody involved in that response. It's we get a lot of fatigue out there because we talk about it and we talk about it and we talk about it, and it finally happened. And to watch that process unfold, to watch all the partners mobilize, it was really a pretty amazing thing to witness. And for the most part, a lot of the systems we have in place seem to work, or were at least able to be adapted for this response. So really neat presentation and great effort by you all. And so I want to pass it on to Wyatt Williams, Oregon Department of Forestry. Wyatt?
Okay, thanks, Troy. I appreciate that. And I want to say thanks so much for joining today. Why we're here today is because of the Oregon Invasive Species Council. There's 27 members. The group decided to develop this Threats and Opportunities Primer document. And I want to say special thanks out to Troy, who's the vice chair, and he's really helped pull this thing together, as well as Samara Group. Can't say enough about them, how good they are. And so the intended audience for today is supposed to be policymakers here in Oregon, the top policymakers, executive branch, Governor's Natural Resource Office, legislature. And so looking at the registration list, looks like most of us are natural resource professionals. So some of this is preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to say you can go to that chat and print off a PDF of this threats and opportunities and give it to your executives at your agency or at your institution. And that's what I did. And I highly recommend that you do that too. Okay, next slide. Okay, so yeah, this is a little bit of review, but I think it's really important for us to talk about this and what are invasive species, you know? Let's make sure we're all on the same page here. And according to the Invasive Species Council, this is what an invasive species is. It has to be non-native in origin, so not from Oregon, and it has to be a pest. Well, let's review. What is that? A pest is an organism that competes with us for resources that we desire. And we'll talk about the tremendous negative consequences here. That's an invasive species. But if you go outside your office right now, in any community, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic, it's going to be a mix of native and non-native species. How they got here, we're not going to talk about that right now, how the non-natives get here. And they're also not all pests. It's also important to point out that there are native species that are pests. And then next slide, please. But the subset of what we're talking about is obviously the invasive species. And those are the ones that cause tremendous negative consequences, like economic consequences or ecological consequences. And also, I just want to point out right here, this is context dependent. Who determines who's the pest? We do as a society, as a civilization. So European honeybees are non-native. They're usually not a pest, but they can become a pest. Same with poison oak there on the left. It's a native species. Some people consider it a pest, others don't. So this is very context dependent, and it's not decided by one person or one agency. Next slide. Also, I think it's important to point out that invasive species, their management falls within the broad category of integrated pest management. So a lot of us on here have been trained in IPM, integrated pest management, and that is a collaborative committee-based approach to solving these big, large-scale problems in pest management. And so some of us might be specialists in one of these or a couple of these areas, but actually we need to take all of these strategies. You don't need to read all of those. Some of those are examples in forestry, but the overall strategies of prevention, cultural control, chemical control, mechanical, biological control, and other options such as doing nothing right now. And there are a lot of species in Oregon, exotic species, that we are not doing anything about. And so some of that was decided at that team approach, that committee approach. And so this is not a monarchy. There are no kings or queens here, and we do pest management properly by committee approach, and that includes invasive species. Okay, next slide. And so this was showed earlier, but it's very important to talk about that timing is critical. So this is our invasive species curve right here, and on the left is early on in the introduction. So this is before any particular invasive species gets to Oregon or to your area. There's going to be zero area infested, and the control cost is going to be zero. And so as time goes on and that invasive species established, it's still feasible economically to detect and eradicate it, but at some point, eradication becomes impossible, and there's only going to be long-term management. It's going to be another pest for long-term management. Okay, next slide. And so we have a lot at stake here in Oregon. Obviously, I work for Oregon Department of Forestry, #3 export industry in the state, valued at $5.2 billion gross domestic product, and it is intertwined in our culture. You know, it's on our license plate. So much of our society is built on one tree species here in Oregon. About 75% of our harvest in the state is one tree species. So we need to be prepared, at least in forestry and other sectors, for these very damaging, very quickly moving invasive species. Okay, next slide. So in forestry, you know, the one I'm most well versed in, we've had some notorious invaders going all the way back to 1910. Plant quarantine pest #1 was white pine blister rust. 1910, huge eradication effort in the 60s and 70s of its alternate host, or 50s and 60s of its alternate host, ribes. Did not work. Still spreading. Balsam woolly adelgid, established in Oregon 1930s, killing high elevation true fir. Still spreading. About 70,000 acres a year we detect from aerial surveys at ODF and Forest Service. Port Orford cedar root disease had huge impacts to the export industry in the 50s and 60s, and the market just basically dropped out for Port Orford cedar. And it's starting to come back now thanks to a lot of IPM work and cultural control. and other strategies besides just detection and eradication. And then sudden oak death is our most recent one here in Oregon that's really affecting private forests in Southwest Oregon. And it was detected in 2001. And I'm not going to cover that too much because Sarah, our next speaker, will. Okay, please, next slide. But this is the only slide I have on sudden oak death. And you can see where it's affecting Oregon, extreme southwest corner of the state. And basically, this was showing one of our strategies at one time, or a strategy that we are contemplating in an IPM scenario. That hashed line at the top of Curry County was proposed host eradication management. But it was just not feasible, and we determined that wasn't going to work. But basically, all the orange and red highlights is where tan oak grows. And Sarah's going to be talking about some important sod discoveries here in the spring, where it's going to be pushing up against that quarantine or over that quarantine boundary. And the bottom line is sudden oak death is here in Oregon, and it's going to continue to spread. And we need to take a collaborative and cooperative approach to managing this pest in the future. Okay, keep going. Gypsy moth is another one that I'm really proud to be part of as in the state. Lots of collaboration among agencies. It's such a big pest. Same with sudden oak death, Phytophthora morum, such a big pest that we need agencies and cooperating at the table. And so gypsy moth is another one where over 500 host species, including DF, is Doug fir. For this one, we have great tools for detection and eradication, and we have a great track record. ODA hangs 15,000 traps or contracts out or works with cooperators to hang 15,000 traps annually in Oregon. That map right there is where it's established in the Northeast United States, and the female on the right, she's laying those sticky eggs, and those sticky egg masses get transported on barbecue grills and other furniture and other items that get shipped from the Northeast to Oregon and other parts of the Pacific Northwest. So we're always getting new detections of those every year. Please advance. Next slide. Here's the risk map for gypsy moth in Oregon. Sorry for the small type there, but everything that's shaded are forests, urban forest, community forest, private forest, state forest, that are susceptible for gypsy moth establishment. So it's over 10 million acres, about 4.8 million acres of federal and 4.8 million acres of private. So we have a lot of at risk here in Oregon for gypsy moth. Next slide. And I'm really proud. Here's a success, is one of our biggest successes in my opinion here in Oregon for invasive species. But we have a 100% track record in Oregon. We, as in all the agencies, our state has a 100% track record in catching gypsy moth early and eradicating it almost always with an organic labeled pesticide. And so from 2016, we had a 9,000 acre project over Forest Park in St. John's in Vancouver, Washington, where over 90 agencies, 90 agencies were involved in outreach and communication and planning and strategy. After delimiting trapping, there were no gypsy moths caught. So that was a success. We, as an agency, as a state, we eradicated this pest. And we've been doing that since early 1980s. Next slide. Here's another one that we're facing in Oregon. It's both an ag and forest pest, just like gypsy moth. 100 million ash trees have been killed by emerald ash borer since 1990s, and it is our costliest invasive forest pest in the U.S. at over $2 billion now. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of what some of the damages look like in an urban forest setting. This is 2006 on a street in Toledo, Ohio, before emerald ash borer. And next slide. And after, so 3 years after, you can see all of those ash trees and are dead and need to be removed, affecting property values and just the sheer cost to clean up in a community. And this is not even counting in the eastern states where ash is grown as a hardwood or timber. So there's all those costs as well. Okay, please advance. So again, like I said, there's the economic cost of tree removal, property value losses, research surveys, and then the ecological costs, which are changes in water quality, sediment, water temperature, and species composition in those riparian areas where ash grows. Okay, next slide. And so here is an ash grove in Oregon. We have a native ash that grows in the Pacific Northwest, Fraxus latifolia. This is 100% ash stand. So all those trees and saplings you see right there are ash. Next slide. Just harbors an immense amount of diversity. This is in the Willamette Valley, 15 miles from the state capital, Ankeny Wildlife Refuge, right in the heart of the Willamette Valley. And there's elk herd, there's rare plants, there's all types of wildlife, and is providing tons of shade over streams and swamps and so on and so forth. So if we were to lose all this canopy, it would have tremendous ecological consequences very, very quickly. Next slide. So the state has developed a risk map. So we know where Oregon ash grows in the state, and so we can target our outreach, education. This is a very, again, example of very collaborative effort that goes into making this map. Even though it has an ODF label on it, lots of agencies were involved in making this map. Next slide. Here's an example of where we hope as Oregon Invasive Species Council to tackle some of these issues collaboratively. We developed the Oregon Forest Pest Detectors with OSU and some other partners on the Oregon Invasive Species Council. And this was an idea from an OSU professor, Amy Grotta, who's sadly no longer with us. She passed away a couple of years ago. The idea was to train professionals who work around trees how to identify invasive pests and then give them a reporting system for early detection. Okay, next slide, please. And that reporting system is the vehicle of the Oregon Invasive Species Council. And so the Oregon Invasive Species Council by statute is required to have a citizen reporting tool, and which is this hotline right here, which is web-based and it's mobile friendly. You don't need a login. You can just make a report. And then all the professionals in the state, several agencies are notified. Next slide. And our forest pest detectors, we've trained over 600 professionals now, and it worked. So a lot of people said this is not going to work. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Well, in 2019, two separate graduates that summer reported odd-looking damage in this plant right here, Twinberry, in Portland. And they both were graduates of our program. They both knew this was not EAB, but they knew it was related to EAB. And lo and behold, we have a new exotic species in Oregon. So it was proof of concept that we can do this. We can do this collaboratively, cooperatively, and that was with a $300,000 grant. We found a new species in Oregon. Okay, next slide, please. Another product we've built, again, collaboratively across agencies, federal and state, is the Emerald Ash Borer Response Plan for Oregon, the first on the West Coast, I might add. And it's available for you to see right now on oregoneab.info. Next slide. And finally, again, this is getting back to the IPM strategy. So not just finding and eradicating, but also developing other tools in managing for this inevitable pest that will arrive someday on the West Coast. We chose to proactively collect seeds and store them in 3 different locations for genetic conservation and for research looking into genetic resistance to emerald ash borer. And so this is a 2-year project. We're about 40% of the way there. And our aim is to collect 1 million ash seeds across 30 populations, and we hope to conserve the genetic diversity of this plant. Okay, next slide. So Oregon Invasive Species Council, in a nutshell, it's established in statute for this coordination among natural resource agencies and other institutions. We've identified the top 100 species, at least in forestry. I'm concerned about forestry. Obviously, I have a slant towards that. So 30% of those pests on the top 100 are forest pests. And the Oregon Invasive Species Council already is set up for a lot of great things, like this emergency control account, which doesn't have any funding. It's had one shot of funding, $500,000 or $350,000 several years ago. So we have an emergency control account, but no funding for that emergency control account. We have lots of other products that I hope you have time to peruse, like our strategic plan and others. A lot of history with Oregon Invasive Species Council. Okay, next slide. This is my last slide. Basically, you know, we have had so many pests and we're likely to face new pests in the future. So we need to keep this coordination going. We need to get our natural resource agencies, our other stakeholders on the council in these rooms, in these virtual rooms, and keep meeting and communicating and coordinating. We need to, in my opinion, we need to employ the incident command structure. That's what's used for wildfire, you know, and other incidents like hurricanes. We need to employ the incident command structure. And the good thing is we already have trained people. We have some of the best in the country, the best in the world. And with the Forest Service and ODF and APHIS all having training in incident command. And that's what we employed for the 2016 Gypsy Moth, and we can certainly do that. The beauty about the incident command, it can contract or expand or contract as needed. We need those dedicated funds for the emergency response. We need a bunch of research and development for early detection, eradication, and long-term management. And finally, we need the policy and government leadership to help us get our job done. Okay, next slide. I just want to thank you so much for listening and attending today, and I am available here or later for questions. Thank you.
Wyatt, thank you so much. You know, I reach out to Wyatt sometimes. He's a tough guy to get a hold of, but it's because he's one of the hardest working people in the biz. I don't know if anybody else or any other programs do more with less. And so, Wyatt, I just appreciate you being here today and appreciate all the work that you're involved in. You're one of the most important players in the game out here, so we appreciate you. And I want to pass it off now to Sarah Navarro, USDA Forest Service. Thank you, Sarah, for being here. It's all yours.
Great. Thanks for having me, Troy. So I'm here to talk about sudden oak death as a case study for strengthening invasive response through partnerships. I think that the work on the mothballs and the zebra mussels is a great example of how you can start early on in the invasive curve and really make a big difference. And I'm here to present today the story of sudden oak death in Oregon to show how we've progressed through the curve and where we're at today and what the future looks like, as well as highlighting how partnerships and collaboration has worked to reduce or to lengthen the timeline of that invasive species curve. And so just some short background on sudden oak death. It's caused by a water mold, Phytophthora ramorum. There's over 100 known species of Phytophthora in the world. Many of them are major agricultural and forest pathogens. Phytophthora in Greek means plant destroyer. And as Wyatt mentioned in his presentation, we do have another Phytophthora in our Oregon forest, Phytophthora lateralis, that causes porterford cedar root disease. And so Phytophthora ramorum was a brand new species to science in the late 90s. It was first introduced in North America in California, and since then has caused extensive mortality of tan oak and coast live oak in California and Oregon. In Oregon, tan oak are the drivers of the disease and the most important species of sudden oak death in Oregon, because they are not only killed by the sudden oak death pathogen, but they also spread the pathogen through the spores that you can see on the top right of the screen. Those spores get carried during wind and rain events and can spread this disease up to 5 to 6 miles during one spread event. And as State Representative David Brock-Smith mentioned in his opening remarks, we do have multiple lineages or strains of this disease in our Oregon forest. Like we're learning with strains of COVID in the news and public health, different strains have different aggressiveness, and that's what we have with Phytophthora ramorum. So before 2015, we had the North American, the NA1 strain in our Oregon forest, and then in 2015 we detected the European strain, the EU1 strain, in tan oak here in Oregon. And the EU1 strain in the UK has been killing larch in plantations, but also damages and can kill western hemlock and Douglas fir when they are grown within close proximity of those infected larch. And so the EU1 strain is more aggressive. We've found it to be more aggressive in our Oregon forest through research with Oregon State University. And so I just wanted to take us all through the SOD timeline in Oregon in relation to the invasive species invasion curve. And so in 1998, we believe is when Phytophthora ramorum was introduced into our Oregon forest in the in and around the Brookings area, so right down here on the southern Oregon coast. And it was most likely introduced through infected nursery stock from California. So you can see a photo of some infected rhododendron on the left. Those midribs and petioles is where we would find the disease. And so although it was introduced into our Oregon forest in 1998, we didn't detect this disease until 2001. We detected it through aerial survey, and this is done in between ODF and the U.S. Forest Service. There's an annual collaborative survey done every year, and it's one of our early detection, or it's one of our detection tools in the toolbox. We've now learned through research that it takes 1.5 to 2 years for tan oaks to turn brown like this for us to detect them through the air. And so although it's a detection tool, it's not an early detection tool for us. And so we also conduct other ground surveys as well as stream surveys in and around to try to earlier detect sudden oak death on the landscape. After the initial detection of sudden oak death in Oregon, this is where the partnerships and collaborations of this forest disease management program really started. It started with pathologists from Oregon State University, ODF, ODA, and the U.S. Forest Service forming a science task force to establish roles and responsibilities for each agency, as well as alerting agency leadership and the importance of doing something on the landscape about this disease. It was established that ODA is the regulatory authority, and they used their authority to establish a state sudden oak death quarantine, which you can see is the dashed yellow line on the animation on the right. Throughout the course of the program, the quarantine has expanded as the disease has expanded on the landscape. And this quarantine requires eradication treatments on private and state-owned lands. Federal agencies do the same on their ownership, although the state quarantine doesn't exactly cover it. The state quarantine also limits and restricts the movement of tan oak material outside of the quarantine area to make sure that there's no risk of spread through logging activities. So ODA was established as they're the regulatory agency. They are going to establish the quarantine and maintain it, while ODF, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management are the on-the-ground agencies for survey, detection, and eradication treatment. Survey and detection efforts are conducted year-round, and right now they're being conducted by 3 full-time staff, 2 at ODF and 1 at the U.S. Forest Service, and they cover 515 square miles in the sod quarantine to try to slow the spread of this disease on the landscape. And so what do eradication treatments for sod look like? As Wyatt had on one of his slides with the integrated pest management, we found that for sudden oak death, eradication treatments are our most effective tool in the toolbox. And I'll go into some of the research that has gone into some of those other tools. But in terms of sudden oak death, our most effective is eradication treatments on the landscape. And so these include cutting and burning key hosts like tan oak within a buffer of infected trees, because as I mentioned, it takes 1.5 to 2 years for a tree to turn red and for us to determine on the ground and sample that it's infected. And so we set a treatment buffer to cut and burn all host material within a specified area to make sure that we're capturing the disease within that area. We also do use herbicides to stop stump sprouting and to prevent reinfection of stumps after treatment. And these treatment area buffers range from 50 to up to 300 or even more feet, depending on the location of the treatments. And these are costly treatments because they are very labor intensive. So they can cost anywhere between $5,000 and upwards of $9,000 recently. But at the same time, there is no cost to private landowners. And in terms of cost for the program, for the last 20 years, we've spent $31 million trying to slow the spread of sudden oak death here in Oregon. And so moving along the invasive species curve, was as I mentioned, detected in 2001. From 2001 to 2005, eradication treatments were being conducted on all lands. In 2010 is when the program shifted from an eradication program, the goal of eradication, to the goal of slowing the spread. It was evident to all involved, all the agencies, that eradication was no longer possible. And so we've continued to slow the spread of sudden oak death and drawn out the time on that invasive species curve. And as Representative Brock-Smith mentioned, the Sudden Oak Death Task Force was convened in late 2016 and fully formed in 2017 by both himself and U.S. Senator Merkley at the time. And so the task force has made a lot of accomplishments. It's made a very big difference in sudden oak death here in Oregon. As the Sudden Oak Death Task Force in Oregon was getting established and off the ground and running, my colleagues in California were reporting sod fatigue with their policymakers, with their agency leaders, everyone just getting tired of hearing about sudden oak death on the landscape down there in California. But here in Oregon, since then, we've had increased state funding for eradication treatments through e-board funding, as well as House Bill 5050 in the 2019-2021 biennial budget cycle. We've had increased federal funding for sudden oak death research through Senator Merkley being lead of the Appropriations Committee for Agriculture. And so Oregon State University has been able to start new research on looking at other tools to have in the toolbox for integrated pest management for sudden oak death. So looking at other uses of chemicals, potentially looking at thinning treatments, also increasing the acorn collections to look for resistance out there on the landscape. So we have been able to increase the other avenues of that integrated pest management approach for sudden oak death recently. And also new partnerships between over 30 organizations. We now have sod task force meetings where someone from the Port of Coos Bay calls in. We have new partnerships between the tribes as well as other federal agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. They've opened up additional funding avenues for landowners for treatments or for post-sudden oak death restoration of their land. And so looking at new partnerships, new funding sources, and this has really been opened up by the sod task force, because I had no idea that NRCS had funding for landowners in that aspect. And so it's great to be able to make those partnerships, make those connections between private landowners, federal landowners, to make sure that we're all continuing with that all lands approach to sudden oak death, as well as continued or increased community engagement and outreach. We have OSU Extension has been getting additional grant funding for citizen science projects, engaging folks down there on the ground, hosting webinars, having local engagement during the sod task force meetings when we have had in-person meetings down in the Brookings area or even in the Bandon area, having local landowners attend those meetings and see the process. And getting that one-on-one with legislatures to tell them exactly what their fears are for spread of sudden oak death, the economic issues that are potentially involved with it, as well as completing a new economic assessment of the sod program. And so this was completed in 2019, and it was completed by a contractor on behalf of ODF, and it shows a 19-to-1 cost savings to continue to slow the spread of sudden oak death in Curry County. And they found that there could potentially be a loss of 1,200 jobs and 15% reduction in timber harvest if the Port of Coos Bay timber exports are sanctioned because sudden oak death reaches into Coos County. And as Wyatt showed in his presentation, the risk of it spreading into Coos County is there because the risk of tan oak spread or risk of sudden oak death spread on our landscape is driven by the abundance of tan oak that's there. And so as we move to the present, we are reaching that tipping point of where sudden oak death will reach the point where it's local management only, and we do have widespread consequences here in Oregon from sudden oak death. And, you know, we have slowed the spread over the last 20 years. We've had recent research come out of Oregon State University that shows that treatments have been effective at slowing the spread, but we are looking at a future where local management and control is an increasing possibility. And as Representative Brocksmith mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, just last week, we had a new detection of sudden oak death outside of our quarantine area, 21 miles north, just north of the town of Port Orford, and 13 miles south of the Coos-Curry County boundary. And so this is a time where it's all hands on deck. And so the Forest Service, ODA, ODF are all working collaboratively together to assess what's going on the ground, to assess the extent of the infestation and where the program is going to move forward. And with that, I just want to also end on a note of, you know, I didn't start out in this program in 2001. I joined in 2016, I believe, but myself and everyone else I work with currently in the program have all taken our positions all accepted our positions from either folks that have retired or have moved on to other agencies. And so the collaborative approach and spirit that they started and formed the program with has continued on to today. And it's something that my colleagues and I are all very proud of. And we're proud to be part of the Oregon Sudden Oak Death program. So with that, thanks for having me today.
Sarah, thank you so much. We're going to move into panel discussion and Q&A here in just a second, and we are a little over time. I think we'll keep it going for as long as people can stay, if people want to hang out past the time. And just real quick before we do, you know, thanks to all the presenters again. One of the things you saw through there was the urgency of these issues. You look at that picture from Wyatt on the in Ohio, right? That was basically a biennium. And so when we think about requesting funding, when we think about requesting support or starting a new program, and we maybe think about putting it off to next year or the next biennium, in some cases that's going to be too late. And so the urgency here cannot be overstated. And the fact that, you know, at all scales, this collaboration, this network is so important. And if the individual agencies and organizations and people within that network aren't strong and don't have good support, then that big network is not nearly as effective. So thank you all for that. We're going to move, like I said, we're going to move into panel discussion and Q&A. I'll give a second here for some more questions to come in. And maybe what I'll do for those of you who may have to step out is, can we skip forward to the award slide just real quick? So we would like to introduce the Outstanding Local Leadership and Collaboration Award. This is a brand new award created this year in honor of Jim Seeley, who's a very important partner down on the South Coast. And so this award will be presented to an individual or group who has demonstrated leadership at the local level and beyond through collaborative efforts to protect cultural, natural, and economic resources from invasive species. And this primer, we've divided the state into these different kind of eco-regions. And so what we'll be looking for is nominations from each one of those regions for somebody or some group of people who have you know, met the requirements here, who have hit those notes and leading through collaborative efforts. So after this webinar, nominations will be live on the website, and then we'll present these awards at upcoming regional webinars where we're going to take some of these same themes but dive into real specific local challenges. And we want to bring those messages that you as invasive species professionals or as members of your community, as a member of a board of directors, those most pressing issues that you want to highlight, we want to hear from you so that we can make sure to incorporate those into the agendas on those regional webinars. So look out for those coming in the future, and please stop by the website and submit your nominations for the Outstanding Local Leadership and Collaboration Award. I'm going to turn that over to Jolene now, and Jolene Littlejohn, the coordinator, will help facilitate the Q&A that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Troy. We do have a couple questions that came in around the zebra mussel, so I'd like to start there, and then we can circle back to a couple questions that will be more relevant across the board. So the first question is, what does the quarantine mean for the retailers and the public?
Well, the quarantine right now means for it's 5 months left, that you won't be able to purchase these products in stores and stuff, unless if they have a seal on them that they've been examined for zebra or quagga mussels and are not present. And that's going to be through the mainly the federal government, APHIS and those agencies to do that. But after 6 months, the rule goes away and retailers can purchase them again.
Okay, thanks, Rick. And will signage be placed at retail outlets to advise customers?
Some stores have already done that, like Petco and PetSmart. We as an agency hasn't developed any signage for it, but we're recommending it.
Rick, the follow-up question to that is that what should existing hobbyists do with their mothballs if they've had it for years?
If they had it for years, they're probably not at risk and just keep it where it's at. If there have been recent purchases, say within the last 6 months, then probably destroy the mothball either by boiling it, treating with bleach or high salinity, and then when the quarantine's over, start over again.
Okay, one more question along these lines is, have you seen an impact from the mothball contamination so far? What does that look like? And how is that being monitored?
Yes, I'm not sure. Impact to the retailers or impact to the environment? If it's impact to the environment, we will start doing sampling this summer when water temperatures get up there for spawning and other methods, so we can detect, see if we can detect quagga or zebra mussels in the system. So it's, stay tuned. We'll see maybe this time next year. We'll have some answers if they got into the environment or not. I should say we're, besides for these, we have several agencies that are monitoring water bodies all through the Northwest, well, the nation, for zebra and quagga mussels. We have federal, like USGS. We have universities like ESU, WSU, Bureau of Reclamation, our own agency. So there's a lot of collaboration going on here monitoring waters in the Pacific Northwest.
Great, thank you. So overall, I don't have any questions specific for the other two presenters, but I would like to ask and give time for anyone that may have them. How do you keep your momentum and morale up when there seem to be so many, more and more invasive species challenges? I think every time we hear a presentation, there's a new detection. There's a new detection outside the containment area, or these things come through your email box. So how do you keep that morale and momentum up moving forward with all of these challenges that are presented to you? And I did have to mute. There was some noise before, so check your mute button to pop in here.
Yeah, I'd like to share a perspective is that there was a national assessment that was done by the EPA back about 8 years ago, where they actually looked at almost every single watershed in the state of Oregon. And fortunately, we found out that only about 40% of our key watersheds really have significant invasive species problems. So about almost 2/3, a little bit less than that, of water bodies and watersheds in Oregon are not heavily impacted by invasive species, or probably don't have many invasive species. And so we're rather fortunate to have this, I wouldn't say pristine, but healthy ecosystems for the most part. And so there's a lot there that's that we can protect. So that's how I maintain my enthusiasm. And also the other aspect is that we have a lot of Oregonians and stakeholders here in Oregon who really care, and they want to ask, what can we do? Just like what we heard about earlier, the questions, what can we do?
That's great.
I can think too that it can feel a little overwhelming at times, but we are in a totally different space now than we were even 10 or 20 years ago working on invasive species issues. And some of the tools that have been developed, like just reporting apps or ways for people to report what they're seeing with their smartphones or with new technologies of even just where they spatially located point with a photo is pretty amazing. That it's not just us as people working for different agencies, it's also our public and the people who are interested in this and learning about their environment, what a native species is, what's invasive, or even just how to report things. And I think that's an incredible benefit of the Invasive Species Council, but also just the knowledge and awareness of everyone. And so I think that's, to me, like, it's very empowering to know that one person can, in this instance for invasive species, especially reporting, one person can make a difference and really potentially change the outcome of an invasion. And so I think that's what keeps me going is just sharing the knowledge and awareness and working with people on this issue.
Yes, very good. Go ahead, Rick.
No, I'd agree. Part of it keeps it interesting is trying to predict what's next coming up. So you get on a steep learning curve trying to figure out, okay, what it is, how do we identify it, how can we handle it when it gets here? And I think Teresa and Sam both mentioned we do a lot of planning, and sometimes that planning gets monotonous, but when you get to use it and you see, oh, it works, it helps to motivate you. Well, that one worked, probably this other one will work too. So that keeps you kind of going. Like I said, when you see successes like, the eradication of feral swine in Oregon decreasing, or you get to control a pond that has rusty crayfish in it, that kind of lets you know, well, you're doing the job you were hired to do, and it's just kind of satisfying. The worst thing is things you can't do things about yet, like nutria. There's so many that they're already well established, and you get, it gets gone out of your control then.
Mm-hmm. Challenging for sure.
Yeah.
So another question, this one is about the Oregon Forest Pest Detector training. And is the Oregon Forest Pest Detector training still ongoing, and who is it available to?
Yes, so this is Wyatt, and Oregon Forest Pest Detector training was developed for natural resource professionals that work in the field. So think park workers, arborists, landscape contractors, ODOT, crews, foresters, those types of people that are clearing trails and campgrounds and stuff like that, to say, oh, I need to be looking for emerald ash borer up in these ash trees that I'm cleaning up. And so who is it available to? The curriculum is online right now. And so if you Google Oregon Forest Pest Detectors, it'll pull up a Oregon State University extension page. And so you can see the curriculum right now. If you pay a small fee, if you register and pay a small fee, you can actually get continuing education credits, I think through Society of American Foresters or PNW, International Society of Arboriculture. So OSU is, Dan Stark is the OSU extension agent that is now leading that. And so you can email me for his contact information, but Dan Stark, but you can just go to the Oregon Forest Pest Detectors website and take the class right now if you want. Yeah, did I answer the question? Sounds like
Yes,
it.
I think so.
Okay.
I put the link in the chat as well for the Oregon Forest Pest Detectors program. So the next question is, I know many ecologically minded anglers who are unaware of invasive species permits required for vessels over 10 feet long. Is there a possibility of increasing ODFW required readings, such as a checkbox during license buying or for buying angling licenses?
Good suggestion. That is a suggestion, hasn't come up before. But you got to be aware that the AIS program or funding and the license is not through ODFW, it's through Oregon Marine Board. They're the bankers for the program. We're just a contractor for it. But that is a good suggestion. I hadn't thought about that. So thank you, whoever gave that suggestion. This might be a good one.
So we'll do 2 more questions. So the next one is, I've had increasing questions about the Asian clam here in the southern Willamette Valley. They're a plant person. Where can I find resources for this species? Sam, do you have information on that?
It depends on the question. If the question is an identification, both ODF and W and Oregon Sea Grant are on the lookout for aquatic invasive species that really good, excellent guides on identifying the Asian clam. But if it's about whether or not one can harvest it and use it for food, that would be, question for ODF and W. And are there ways that we can actually prevent this spread? And could it be confused with, say, a zebra mussel? That would be another question. So it depends on the question. They are very widespread, unfortunately, because of the way that they were introduced. But we often do get reports of people finding Asian clams and thinking that they're actually zebra mussels. And we also have many questions: can I harvest them? And do I need a permit? And is it legal to harvest them? I'll turn that over to Rick. But we do have guides for identification.
The guides, we can connect on the guides. So it looks like the clarification is for ID and then management for landowners. I also have, so we can share some guides, and I have Christine Moffett is another council member who is willing to help field some questions as well over email. But just wanted to note that.
The Xerxes Society has pretty good stuff too for identification. And no, freshwater mussels are illegal to harvest in Oregon due to the contamination in them.
You mean freshwater clams?
Freshwater clams. No, freshwater clam. Well, yeah, freshwater clams are illegal too, but we talked about Asian mussel. I'm in mussel mode.
Mussel mode.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question for you all, for anyone that wants to answer. We've talked a lot about partnerships. We've talked a lot about resources and different programs. What are the resources and support that you feel that we need to effectively keep these programs moving, keep these partnerships moving for prevention and management of invasive species? This is sort of it's a really big question, but you can just target some of the things that are really present in your work or your opinion.
I can start. I can say from the 20 years that we've been running the sudden oak death program in Oregon that the keys to our success have been education and outreach to be able to access private landowner ground and do those treatments as soon as we can, because we know that the sooner we get the infected trees on the ground, the more success we have at keeping that infestation small. Coordination between agencies is super key, as we've all mentioned in all of our presentations today. I was contacted by an APHIS colleague a couple months ago about a program review for Phytophthora ramorum, and they said, what advice would you give to a state in the Midwest that found sudden oak death in their forest? And I said, make sure that the lines of communication between their state agencies of forestry and agriculture were already established with the federal agencies of forestry and agriculture, so that you can hit the ground running, like the response plan for EAB. So make sure that that's already in place so you're not having to build relationships at the same time that you're trying to get the word out, like with the mothball incident. And then finally, funding. I mean, we are in federal and state agencies where we cannot lobby on behalf of ourselves, but we've seen with sudden oak death that having the funding available for eradication treatments has led to us being able to slow the spread.
I'd like to chime in as well. Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be going to the Oregon Invasive Species Council meeting since 2012. And I would say a key to success is this Oregon Invasive Species Council structure, which in statute requires all the member agencies to attend quarterly business meetings. It's there at the meetings where the agency representatives discuss the importance and the developments of what have been going on in the respective agencies in the last 3 months or 4 months since the last Oregon Invasive Species Council meeting. Without that type of regular coordination and communication, our state would be much, much worse off in the invasive species part of our natural resource management. We would be so far behind without the Oregon Invasive Species Council. Just having those 4 quarterly meetings where we get together and discuss these things and talk about collaborative approaches for survey, for treatments, for long-term management, for research. Yeah, and just being open to other ideas, using that collaborative approach. Like, we are all trained, we all have some sort of training bias in our university system, but realizing that we each have those built-in biases about our upbringing, where we came from, our culture. We need more diversity. We need more diverse thought into controlling these issues. It can't be one agency, one person. It has to be this collaboration. And so without the Oregon Invasive Species Council as that vehicle, I don't know what would serve as that. I mean, maybe someone else can help me with that, but Sarah's right. We can't advocate for ourselves. Like, we know what it takes to get the job done, but we can't say we need more money. I mean, we can within our own ranks, but we can't go to the legislature or directly to the governor. So I think that was kind of the point. Lots of people, lots of agencies on the Oregon Invasive Species Council realize that, and thus today's primer.
Sarah mentioned that funding is important, but also all the states are dealing with invasive species, so manpower is getting tougher and tougher to find to work these programs. And though invasive species can establish really quickly, it may take years to eradicate them or get in control, and to keep the interest up from volunteers and others can be difficult.
I want to pop in real quick too. Sarah mentioned it in her sudden oak death presentation, but because we have that limited capacity at the state and federal scales, if we can't get a hold on things, eventually it falls to local management. And we've seen that with countless noxious weed species. And so when that happens, if those local jurisdictions aren't empowered and they're not supported to take on that management, then that area's in big trouble. And to get to the outreach and education, it sometimes seems so monotonous, right? We pass out the same 10 brochures at the fair and at these different meetings. But if you think about the last 3 major scares in the Northwest with the Asian hornet, the giant hornet, when we think about the spotted lanternfly, and of course with the mothballs and zebra mussels, those were all reported and discovered by 3 members of the public. Just an average Joe at work, and they at some point got some education about something, and that little bit of education that they got allowed them to recognize the threat, get it reported, and that type of engagement at all scales leads to the kind of success that Wyatt brought up with things like the gypsy moth. What an amazing success story that is, and one that we can't often tell when we're talking about invasive species, to say that we've been able to keep something eradicated like that for that long. That's just a real testament to the value of that collaboration and that sense of urgency.
Sam, did you want to jump in?
Oh, good.
That's the end of our Q&A session.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone who attended.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you all. To close this out, remember, you know, we are all, we work for who we work for, right? But when we clock out, we're regular citizens, and we're a constituent of our local leadership, of our state leadership, and of our federal leadership. And so write letters, attend those meetings. Public meeting notices are posted all over the place for all sorts of different committees and organizations and groups that are the ones who handle this kind of stuff. So I just strongly encourage everyone out there to encourage your networks as well. Write those letters, show up to those meetings, write those op-eds in your local newspaper, and you know, keep banging on the door, because if we don't, and now, you know, as COVID budgets will continue to be affected, I call them COVID budgets now, but as budgets will continue to be affected over the next couple of years as we recover for this, it seems like maybe now is not the time to ask, but actually now is the most important time, because as that funding diminishes, as these pools get smaller, and purse strings get tighter, it's the priorities, it's the time. You know, now is the time to get that message across about what the real priorities are, because if you don't ask for it now, you're probably not going to get it later. So I want to thank everybody on behalf of the council, on behalf of all of our presenters, and thank all of our presenters today. I just want to thank you all for coming today. This presentation has been recorded, and we will release it out to the public, and we encourage you to send it to your local representatives, city council members, city managers, boards of directors at different agencies that can affect these type of challenges. So we'll let you all know when that is ready. And just thank you again. If you have any more further questions for follow-up, please email Jolene at the address on the screen. And enjoy the rest of Invasive Species Awareness Week.
Yeah, actually, I would like to have one thought, is that for those who are part two have joined us, it'd be really valuable as we establish regional webinars that maybe you want to be engaged, contact Jaylene Littlejohn, or the coordinator of the Invasive Species Council, and you could be a part of that ground roots level in developing these webinars and including your perspectives. We really value that.
Great.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jaylene.
Forward to the next one. Bye.
See you later.
Thanks, everyone.